All right, everybody, welcome in. My name is Joe, and today we're going to talk about some chess. So we talked previously about how to start playing chess, right? How to get involved in the game without just moving pieces around. A lot of that we talked about from the white side of the board, and today we're going to flip things and look at it from the opposite side. And we talked specifically about developing, right? Controlling the center, not moving too many pawns, but getting our pieces developed into the game. Typically knights before bishops. And then we talked about castling to safety and how these are just some really good opening principles. I happen to have a video I did specifically on opening principles. But the idea here is that this is a very easy to memorize pattern, right? Whether the bishop is up here on b5 or whether it's on c4, this is very easy to memorize, and you can play it against almost anything your opponent throws at you. Now, you will have to pay attention. You can't just blindly move pieces, but that's the whole purpose, right? Is we have a pattern that we can memorize. If our opponent either just starts throwing things around, we have some opening principles on how to refute that and how to play solid chess. And we now have this pattern that we can memorize that develops with purpose and gives us a plan. Now, let's flip the board over and let's see what happens from the other side. All right, you sit down in front of a chessboard, you're presented with the black pieces. Your opponent might know what they're doing, and in that case, you're gonna be faced with two openings most of the time. The Italian game and the Ruy Lopez, and so we're gonna need some kind of response to those, right? Typically, you're gonna see your opponent lead off with an E-pawn. Maybe they lead off with a D-pawn, though, so we're gonna need some kind of response to what happens if your opponent leads off with a Queen's pawn game. Or what if they do something completely unheard of that you have no idea what you're doing? Do we have some kind of standard pattern that we can memorize from the black side of the board that we can play against anything? Yes, we do. All right, so let's dive into it real quick. If your opponent leads off with one of the most common openings, an E-pawn move, right? The king's pawn, just like we would be playing, we're going to mirror that. We're going to help control the center with our pawn. We're going to stop white from moving forward. And now, the most common thing that white's going to do is they're going to probably develop with tempo. And now how do we respond? Well, I'd love to say keep up the mirror, but you can't really exactly mirror that. You could. This is an opening known as the Petrov, or the Russian. We're not talking about that. We're talking specifically what happens. This is what I would recommend, is bring your knight out, develop your knight, and defend. So from the black side of the board, you'll notice a lot of times we talk about defending and over-defending, right? Since we have to respond to what white plays, because in the beginning of the game, white has the first move, they have the first tempo, and they sort of dictate a little bit what's happening. Black has to be a little responsive, but there are ways to kind of take that initiative back. But we are going to play good, solid chess. We're going to develop our knight. We're going to defend. And then your opponent's going to play probably one of these two bishop moves. Let's start off with the Italian game. Let's say your opponent plays into the Italian game. That's fine. There's tons and tons and tons of theory about the Italian game. We're not going to go into all of that. We're going to talk a little bit about it. But what I recommend, again, is mirroring. This setup here is known as the Giuoco piano. It's a very solid opening. It's very principled from both sides of the board. And if you get to this position, from here on out, just play good chess. It's all you have to do. I would recommend immediately getting this knight is going to be one of your priorities, is to get this knight and get castled. These are your two priorities from this position. Your opponent has a lot of things they could play, but in the back of your mind, after you respond to what your opponent does, knight up and castle, right? Now, why do I say that? All right, so white has a ton of things they could play here. They could play what's known as the Evans Gambit. If they play that, oh no, my bishop's under attack, I have to respond to that. I can't get my knight involved. I have to respond to the bigger threat. All right, so let's go ahead and respond to that. But if they were to play something like, I don't know, a standard developing move, nothing's being threatened, I'm safe, develop my knight. These are your important steps. What happens if they play, I don't know, something aggressive? Okay, now we have to talk. Why would someone make this move? Well, because there's pressure on a very weak pawn right in front of the king, things are going to get ugly. But notice, this bishop is still locked in, so your queen controls that square, so your opponent can't do this. You can grab that knight for free. Which is why I recommend bringing your bishop out first before your knight. If we back up and you bring the knight out, this is what's known as the two knights defense. Two knights defense is fine. If you want to learn the two knights defense, go for it. 100% go. I don't know the two knights defense because this knight move blocks the queen, and your opponent has this move now. Now this knight is safe, and now we look at the pressure here. And you think, well, it's just a pawn. What's the big deal? I'm just going to keep developing, right? Wrong. Things go very bad very quickly from this position. If your opponent plays with the bishop, that comes with check. There is no way to block check, so you're forced to move your king. Oops. You're forced to move your king, and either wherever you move your king, you're now giving up castling privileges. Your king is going to be slightly unsafe, and you're going to have a little bit more work to do to stay involved in this game, and you've given white a ton of initiative. Now, it's not game over. It's just game very complex. So that's why I recommend staying away from it. Now, the other thing your opponent could do is they could grab with the knight. You can't capture back because it's defended. And this knight is threatening both the queen and the rook. Let's say you castle from here, you drop a whole queen. You save the queen, you drop a whole rook. Again, this gets ugly very quickly. So this is why I recommend, as a beginner, we just stay away from the two knights defense. Or if you want to play the two knights defense, go do some research on it. I don't know the two knights defense, so I can't coach you on it. There's tons of theory on it, and I recommend you go look that up. The other dangers of this position, let me see if I can remember the dangers. Let's say that you're like, oh no, this setup I don't like, and you push a pawn, and you think, hey, I have solved my problems because, there's no more danger here, right? Well, what happens if your opponent takes? Now they're threatening this knight, and you think, well, I guess I can grab back. I mean, hey, this is a free knight, right? I grab back. Here's where we're into what's known as the fried liver attack. And unfortunately, the fried liver attack is very bad for black. This white sacrifices the knight, forces black. Black, you can do anything you want, but notice, again, we have danger here. So black pretty much has to accept the knight. You're thinking, hey, it's fine, right? Whatever. My king is a little unsafe, but I'll develop and I'll hide the king out of the way. We'll be fine. Except there's more pieces to involve in the game. And I want you to notice this is the threat. Wherever black king goes, there's two attackers in this knight. Black has to defend check. If black were to hide, which seems natural, right? First off, you lose the knight. Unfortunately, you lose the knight with checkmate. Even if you grab with the queen and you trade queens, still not good enough. It's still checkmate. So the fried liver attack is very deadly. That's how it got its name. It's my favorite name in chess. I mean, it just hands down my favorite name, the fried liver. And it comes because if your opponent goes into the fried liver attack, your opponent is as dead as an over-fried piece of liver. The best move in this case is actually, if you're playing black and you fall into the fried liver, it's okay. You just have to remember that you have to move out of check and defend this knight. It is ugly. This is a very ugly position to be in for black, but if we turn the engine on, I don't know if this will show up. Yeah, the The evaluation's not that bad. It's like a half a point to a point in white's favor. It's not the end of the world, and it's not checkmate. You could play this, and for beginners like me, a half a point difference one way or the other, not a big deal. But for experts, they're not going to fall into this. So that's why I recommend there's a lot of theory around the two knights that I don't know. The fried liver is the one that I do know just because I love that name. It's just such a funny name, the fried liver at back. But if you're playing from the black side of the board and your opponent plays into the Italian, just mirror, bring your bishop up, go into the Gioco piano. From here, white is going to play classical chess, you're going to play classical chess, and you're going to have opportunities on both sides of the board. I'm not going to go too much into theory, but you can see the most common moves I'm going to highlight here. This is the classical Italian. This is what's known as the Gioco pianissimo. The name just means, Gioco piano just means the quiet game. You're not going to see a lot of trades. You're not going to see a lot of pieces exchanged off. The Gioco pianissimo is the even quieter game. The idea being that white is making this is what I used to play. I played this a lot. White is making slow, deliberate, calculated moves, hoping that black makes a mistake. Not really hoping, but as a beginner, that's how I played. I would just play over protecting my pieces, over defending everything, and wait for my opponent to make a mistake, and then that's when I would basically use their mistake to my advantage. You can do the same thing as black by, from here, continuing to develop. Now notice, this developing move that you made with your knight, now you're ready to castle. Like I said, this is your priority in the Italian game, is to get castled with black. Then now, this knight attack doesn't have any teeth. You notice the knight is defended, so even if your knight moved, you're not going to be able to capture back. But the reason we did this was, now that the pressure is here, all we have to do is castle. And now our rook stops any of that penetration. It stops any of that. If your opponent wants to trade away both of their pieces for your rook and a pawn, that's fine. The experts will actually tell you that's better for black. In this position, black is ahead. Black has lost a rook, but basically picked up two pieces for it. And if black just plays smart chess from here on out, and both white and black play good chess, black will come out ahead. So don't be afraid of this pressure as long as you're castled. So that's why the priority all the way back here, as soon as your opponent plays the Italian game, your priority is to develop this bishop, develop this knight, and get castled. Those are your priorities. And unless your opponent does something to immediately challenge that plan, stick to that plan, okay? Now, I recommend the mirroring game. It's the most common move, and there's more theory on that than there is anything else. So as you're playing these games, you're going to see people also play these games, and you're going to learn how they develop. There is this alternative. It's still developing the bishop and getting the bishop out. It's still getting you ready to develop your knight so you can castle. This is known as the Hungarian. I have played this before from black side of the view because this is a super, super conservative, defensive structure. The idea being that once let's say your opponent once you develop this knight, now you've got extra defense on this knight. So any attack that comes along here, you really are not worried about at all, because there's nothing. Even if your opponent were to do this move and you castle, you've got this extra defended. From the Italian game, the Gioco piano, let's say, your opponent could develop this way, and you'll see this quite a lot. It pins the knight. Your queen is kind of stuck defending this knight. You don't have to, right? The knight is defended by this pawn, but one of the principles is king safety. And if your opponent captures and you open up a line in front of your king is not quite as safe. You can still do that, and if you need to, it's there for you. It's a resource for you. But white is going to pin this knight, force the queen to kind of keep an eye on it. And as black develops, you kind of are hampered a little bit here. You know, kind of forces this kind of thing, and then the bishop backs up. And do you really want to push another pawn in front of your king? No, because that's anti-principled. So you don't want to do that. So this pin is going to sit here for a while until you figure out how to maybe push this pawn all the way up, maybe get your queen up here to defend it this way and not be pinned. You see what I'm saying? It could happen, but don't let that stop you. This is not a bad thing. This is still fine. And like I said, if your opponent captures, I recommend capturing back with the queen. Just a better move to keep this structure in place. You can bring your rook out. Your queen is not under attack. You can always bring your queen straight back home if it has to. Not a problem. But don't be afraid of this at all. The only difference is, Italian game. From this position, I have been known to bring this bishop back. It may not be the best move in the world. It may end up getting trapped by this pawn. It is a separate type of opening. That's why I recommend, that's why I end up transitioning into playing a game where I started just bringing this bishop here and playing the Hungarian, because, if your opponent plays into this line, now there's no concerns at all. This queen is not pinned. You can move the queen wherever you want. The bishop is still useful here. It's as a defender, and it controls some spaces. Yeah, okay, maybe this pawn, you got to figure out how to develop this pawn somewhere. Maybe this pawn sits here for a while and doesn't actually go anywhere. Maybe that means you have to develop your light square bishop this way. So there are lots of different ways you can play this, but this is what's known as the Hungarian. So if your opponent plays the Italian game, I recommend the mirroring version, the Gioco Piano. If you don't want to play that and you want to play a slight variation, try the Hungarian. And if you like any of these names, go look them up. They're fun to look up. You know, you can say, okay, let me look up the Hungarian and see what cool theories are out there, or cool traps are out there. But this is the Italian game. If you see your opponent, right, so let's start at the very beginning. Your opponent plays an e-pawn move. You just mirror their pawn. They play a knight move attacking. You play a knight move defending. They play a bishop move. You're going to play a bishop move. Most of the time, you're probably going to play here. Occasionally, you may retreat to there, or you may just play the Hungarian straight up. But from the Gioco Piano, from the Italian game, actually regardless of wherever your bishop goes, if you see the Italian game, what are your priorities? Get this knight developed and get castled. Remove any threat of any of my errors are getting ugly. Remove any threat of this pressure. Just remove it completely by getting castled. Because once you are castled, no danger anymore. All right, so that's the Italian game. Let's reset the board and let's look at Open Explorer. Flip the board. Oh wait, why didn't that work? Hang on. Hold, please. All right. So let's take a look at, again, our opponent leads with an e-pawn. We push an e-pawn. They develop a knight and attack. We develop a knight and defend. And now we move into the Ruy Lopez. You're going to see the Ruy Lopez a lot, okay? What do you do in the Ruy Lopez? Two moves. Just remember these. Choose either the knight or the pawn. Those are your two moves. As long as you remember those two moves, you're fine with the Ruy Lopez. Either one is totally fine, and either one is the most common move. In fact, I look at the engine, the database. The top two moves by far are the a6 pawn and the knight to f6, by far. A third move that's not quite as popular is this d6. All right, so why is that? Why would the d6 move be an option? What is white trying to do right here? Notice this comes with an attack on the knight. Who cares? It's an even trade, right? What was this knight's job, though? The knight's job, the knight's job is to defend that pawn. And if your opponent trades, all of a sudden, your pawn is no longer defended, and your opponent has a free pawn. Okay? So, the pawn move is known as the Morphy defense. This is the most common defense of this position there is. There's a few moves that can happen from here. This is what I started playing because there is a really nice trap, right? A trick in this position for black. So as black, like I said, when you start playing a game, white has the initiative. Black can take back the initiative right here. By pushing this a6 pawn, you are asking white to make a decision, to either commit to making this capture or committing to retreat. White could retreat back here to c4 and go into essentially an Italian game structure with giving black a free pawn move. If they do that, then you just go back to your Italian game. You just go back to getting developed just like you would in the Italian game. Most of the time they're not going to do that. If they, just like in the Hungarian game when I was talking about earlier, most of the time what they'll end up doing is they'll just play into the Italian game. They won't play the Ruy Lopez and then back up into an Italian structure. Okay, so from here, white has two choices, either capture or retreat. This is the trick that I'm talking about, and it's one of the reasons why I started playing a6 a lot, because I wanted to encourage white to go into this line. I wanted to encourage white to capture. Now we're going to make an unprincipled move here. We are going to capture away. Normally we want to control the center, and we control the center with our pawns, but in the Ruy Lopez, when they exchange, we're going to capture away from the center. Now it looks like we've given up a free pawn, and we want that. From playing from the black side of the board, we want our opponent to go after that, because now we have this early queen move that attacks both the pawn and the knight. Your opponent can only save one. There is no move that your opponent can do to save everybody. Nothing they can do. They can only save one. Well, obviously they're going to save the knight. And so the most common move from here is just to retreat back, give up that pawn. Now, from the black side of the board, this is fine for black, and I'm very happy because I'm going to grab with check. White has only two legal moves, either to move or defend. If they defend, I'm going to exchange queens. White's king is now stuck in the middle of the board, cannot castle. Black is still totally ready to castle either king side or queen side even, depending on what white plays. But from here, you go back to playing normal, good, everyday principled chess. The difference is black has taken a little bit of the initiative. White's a little bit unsafe. Okay, so they have good pawn structures. They haven't messed with their pawns. Black's pawn structure is a little funky, but now we're into like advanced mid-game tactics, advanced positional chess. That's not the scope of this video at all. I'm not the coach for that. Once you get to this point, though, black has accomplished a lot of positive things, and playing against a new player, you're going to be happy. White is not going to be happy having their king exposed in the center of the board. From the black standpoint, do not get overly cocky and start throwing material down the board. Play solid chess and let your opponent start making mistakes from here, because this is a position they're not going to be comfortable with, and they're going to start making mistakes. And that's your time to shine. You've taken the initiative back, and you're going to take advantage of those mistakes. All right? So this is why I play way back here in the Ruy Lopez. When your opponent plays Ruy Lopez, it's why I played the Morphy defense. I want to encourage my opponent to capture, hoping that they will fall into my trap. Now, from a evaluation standpoint, it's really not that big of a deal. And if I turn on the engine, it is a slight advantage. The numbers up here are at 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, 0.8. And again, for a beginner standpoint, less than one pawn's worth of advantage is not really much of an advantage. The material on the board is identical, so there's really not that main of a difference. And so white can continue to play this totally fine. But as beginners, as we're learning the game, this gives us a positional advantage. It puts us in a good situation. All right. So let's go back to Ruy Lopez. Opponent plays a Ruy Lopez. From the Morphe defense, they could retreat their bishop. Like I said, if they retreat to here, then we're just going to go back to playing an Italian game. We have this extra pawn move, but we're going to go back to playing the Italian game. We've even got an option to expand on the queen side early, but most likely your opponent's probably going to retreat, and that's fine. What I recommend from here is you can either push the bishop away, and they'll have to retreat, and then go back to playing good chess. Actually, from here I would recommend developing a bishop, but that's neither here nor there. The idea being that, if they don't capture and if they retreat, we're going to push another pawn. Now you're thinking, man, you've pushed a lot of pawns in this opening, but not really. You made 1 pawn move, 2 pawn move, 3 pawn moves. It's not too many. But what that has done is that has forced White's tempo. White has played 1 move, 2 moves, 3 moves with the exact same piece, which is an anti-principled move, right? They are pushing the same piece around. Now, yes, it does give them this nice long diagonal, just like they would in the Italian game, but we've already expanded on the queen side. Now, eventually, we're going to have to continue to develop and get castled, but once we do that, we have got a little bit of an attack already started. That attack's not going to happen until much later in the game, and that's okay. These guys, your opponent is going to look at targeting them because your opponent thinks that these are going to be weaknesses. That's okay. Let them. We're going to strengthen our king side, and we're going to be in a nice position ready to play good chess, right? That's all we're trying to do, is set ourselves up to play good chess. So from here, now that our opponent has moved back to this nice long diagonal, we go back to the Italian game style, right? We're going to go ahead and either develop our knight. I recommend bishop to c5, just like it were an Italian game type setup. Right, get our bishop on this nice long diagonal. Notice since we've already pushed these pawns, if we have to retreat our bishop, we can retreat it. We've got options to retreat it. If our opponent plays a pawn or something that forces us to move our bishop out of the way, we have options. That's the best that we could ask for. Our opponent's going to develop. We develop. If they try anything funky, doesn't matter. We're ready to castle. We're in a good, solid setup. We can even get our light square bishop out one of 2 different ways. We have options. See how this works? All right. So, starting at the beginning, your opponent leads off with an e-pawn. You push an e-pawn, right? King's pawn versus king's pawn, you're happy. Opponent's going to develop a knight in attack. You're going to develop a knight to defend. Then they're going to develop their bishop. If they develop the Ruy Lopez, you've got the Morphe defense. Your outside A pawn is going to attack that bishop. Now they can retreat. We're going to push it away. And then from here, we're just going to go back to developing like normal, right? If they capture, we do an anti-principled move and capture away from center, opening up our queen and hoping our opponent captures. This trap, this early queen attack, only works because our opponent has not defended this pawn. If they were to develop and defend this pawn, this queen trap doesn't work anymore. That's okay. We continue developing like normal. We continue to play those standard principles. Get our bishop out, get our knight out, and get castled. Okay? If our opponent grabs that pawn, though, thinking they've won a free pawn, wonderful. We attack both. And if you forget, oh no, I'm supposed to attack both, but I forget, notice you can't go here because that square's defended. Nothing else, no other squares attack both. So there's really only one square that attacks both and doesn't immediately get captured. Your opponent has to retreat this knight somewhere. Now, if you're playing a new player, they're going to stop and they're going to think for a while and they're going to try to figure out, how do I defend this pawn and my knight at the same time? They'll realize they can't. And so they'll come up with a way to either retreat the knight in some way. Notice, even if they retreat here, it's defended. That's fine. You capture with check. They could block, at which point in time, your queen has an alignment issue. So you want to take care of that. Well, here's one way to develop and defend, so that way if someone tries to attack your queen, you can move your queen out of the way. Most of the time you'll find that they retreat their knight back to one of these two squares, grab that pawn back, you're back to even material, they have to defend, trade off those queens, go back to developing just like you would, just like normal, except your opponent's king is stuck in the middle of the board and a little bit unsafe, and your opponent is rattled, and you can now just continue to develop, play good chess. All right, last up for the Ruy Lopez. Let's go back to the very beginning. King pawn, knight attack, knight defend, Ruy Lopez. Because you know that this trap exists, you do not have to defend this pawn right away. Right? You want your opponent to grab that pawn. So you can then develop your knight early and attack their pawn. This is known as the Berlin defense. Now, if your opponent captures, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to encourage them to grab this pawn, and if they grab, we've got the same exact line. The only difference is now we have two attackers here, so we can choose. There are some things to worry about, not really worry, but there are some subtleties to this position. Notice this. Now we have to retreat. Now they have a check. Blah, blah, blah. So there are some advances to this, but that's okay. Like, who cares, right? We're going to keep developing and developing as normal. There are no, all right, there's lots of gotchas, but they get into, you know, lots and lots and lots of theory down the road that we're not going to get into. You can even just do this exact same thing. The difference is now your queen is defended. You do have to be careful because your queen is pinned. So if your opponent were to do something, let's say you were to develop, your opponent would do something like this. Queen is pinned, so you still are going to have to trade it off, but that's okay. You're ready to castle, your opponent is not. I don't know, I'm just making moves at this point in time, just developing. Everything is defended. You can drop this guy back to defend, you can rotate this guy around, you can, you know, whatever. You can even just start trading off material and really making your opponent's day unhappy, right? So, Ruy Lopez, you've got the Morphy, you've got the Berlin, both of them are fine. Both of them are perfect defenses. You're hoping your opponent's going to capture because you want to drop into that trap. As you start to play, your opponents are not going to fall into that trap. They are simply going to defend this pawn through other means. Once they defend that pawn, they are safe, and now you just play principled chess. You go into the Berlin, your opponent's going to defend that pawn. That's why I started playing the Morphy, because if you look at the Berlin defense, the Berlin defense is immediately attacking. And your opponent, if they are playing principled chess, they're going to say, you know what? My pawn is attacked. I want to defend it. The difference is your opponents don't have to defend this. If your opponent castles, this is not a free pawn. It looks like it, but it's not. And that pin right there is going to be ugly for the rest of the game. All right, so if you're playing the Ruy Lopez, both of these pawns are not freebies. Do not think that they are freebies. If you are attacking, that's not a freebie. At least not until you get some help on your own pawn. At least not until you get castled. At least not until you get a little bit more developed. Okay? And your opponent, for them, this is not a freebie pawn. At least not until they get more developed, more defense. All right? So keep that in mind. If you're playing the Italian game, the Ruy Lopez, you've got the Berlin, you've got the Morphy defense. These two pawns, both of them, are poison pawns. And whoever captures immediately is going to suffer. So don't capture it right away. If you're the black player, don't capture right away. If your opponent does capture right away, you know what to do. All right? So we've done the Italian game. We've done the Ruy Lopez. Now let's go all the way back. what happens here? Well, let's talk about it for a second. Alrighty, so you sit down in front of the board, you're playing from the black pieces, your opponent leads off with a queen's pawn. Or if they lead off with pretty much anything else that you don't recognize, right? If they lead off with the d-pawn, we're going to lead off with a d-pawn as well, and we're going to go into probably an Italian game, probably a Ruy Lopez. From there, we're going to play solid chess. If our opponents lead off with a d-pawn, though, well, what do we do? I'm going to introduce you to the King's Indian defense, or the King's Indian setup. This is named after the masters from India, specifically the Calcutta area of India. Dates back to the mid-1800s. It's known as hyper-modern. Modern chess is what is the 500-year-old history of chess. That's modern chess. Hyper-modern is the last 150 years of chess, where you want to control the center, not with your pawns, like we've talked about this whole time, but with your long-range pieces, okay? There are tons of debates between modern versus hyper-modern, classical versus whatever, right? Romantic, chess, blah, 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 blah. Don't worry about any of that. Don't worry about it. This is the King's Indian setup, known for the masters out of India. The idea being that your opponent is going for some kind of Queen's Gambit. And you probably have heard the name Queen's Gambit quite a bit. There is a fun series on TV. Which was came from a book. But anyway, you've heard the term Queen's Gambit quite a bit. I play the Queen's Gambit quite a lot. I have found it to be a lot of fun. But if your opponent leads off with something that you don't know anything about, I'm going to introduce you to the King's Indian. The King's Indian versus the Queen's Indian. The King's Indian, because we're developing our knight. Now, if we back up for a second, if your opponent were to lead off with a d-pawn, an e-pawn, their king's pawn, and you think, hey, I'm going to jump into a King's Indian, I'm going to show my opponent what's what. This is actually an opening known as the Alekhine, or the Alekhine. It is from the Russian master, Alexander Alekhine. And I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I actually have a video series on the Alekhine, or the Alekhine. Alekhine was known as a crazy counter-attacker, and his games all have that theme of crazy counterattacks. This is not the video for that, because there is a lot of theory that is way above my head and has, well, I encourage you to go look. I'll make sure I link Alekhine or Alekhine in the links. But if your opponent leads off with the king's pawn, this is not the King's Indian. Okay, so we know what to do if a king's pawn, we're going to play a king's pawn. But if your opponent leads off with a queen's pawn, we're going to go bring our knight up. And we're going to start, this is a generic setup that you can use, again, almost no matter what your opponent plays. It's a little bit advanced, but hear me out. From here, most likely your opponent's probably going to play a pawn. Most likely they're going to play, since they played with the queen's pawn, they're probably going to play with their c-pawn to set up some kind of Queen's Gambit. From here, you're going to play g6. Now this pawn structure is getting ready for what's known as a fianchetto. Fianchetto is just the Italian word for little flank. You are moving your bishop just enough out of the way so that your king can slide underneath. It's a fianchetto. It's a fancy term. From here, your opponent's probably going to develop a knight, and either knight they develop, you're now free to develop your bishop. And now you've got this nice long range piece. You've got your knight. So this is why it's called a hypermodern, because you're using your pieces to control the center and not your pawns. From here, there are a couple things to be aware of. It is possible your opponent is going to, say, continue developing with a knight. Maybe they'll push a pawn. And if they do either one, if they develop their knight, you are free to castle. And now look how safe this is. Your bishop is attacking and defending. Your knight is attacking and defending. You're already castled. Look how quick that was. Boom, boom, boom. But the thing that you have to remember, the King's Indian, once you get to this point, and actually realistically anywhere along this path, if your opponent plays their king's pawn, remember that the king's pawn is the signifier that we can't do the straight King's Indian. Any point in time your opponent plays the king's pawn, and you're going for the King's Indian setup, you need to basically put a king's pawn breaker. All right. So if they play the king's pawn, we can't castle just yet because there are some threats here. And so before we castle, we're actually going to push this pawn. Like I said, this is a little bit advanced, but if you learn this, you're going to be fine because you can play King's Indian against pretty much anything that white does. Like I said, technically you could even do it against some kind of e-pawn opening, but there's theory there that goes down other lines that I don't want to get into. But this pawn here is going to help stop this show. And if your opponent continues on with some kind of e-pawn attack, black is actually better here because capture, capture. Now we can trade off the queens. Your opponent's probably going to have to either take with the knight or take with the king as the only two legal moves. And either one that they do is good for black. So let's say that they capture with the knight. Then we can now move this knight with tempo. There's lots of places we can move this knight to. I'm just kind of scanning through the database of the most common moves. You can even retreat the knight all the way back to the home square. I don't like that for beginners. I think that it would be better to develop the knight into any one of these squares. And notice by doing so, let's say we go the safe move, right? We have now opened up an attack on a pawn that now our opponent has to scramble to defend. And now black has maintained the initiative or taken the initiative back from white, and black is controlling the game. Again, that gives us a little bit of an advanced technique, advanced advantage that's going to help us push our game to the next level. All right, so let's go all the way back to the beginning. If at any point in time when we're playing the King's Indian, if we see this e-pawn show up, if the opponent plays the king's pawn, we play king pawn breaker. That's all we do. And then whatever our opponent plays, let's say they continue developing, now we're safe to castle. We've got our king's pawn breaker ready to go. If this opens up, we trade off the queens. We force white into our game where we are super defensive. We've eliminated the queens, the strongest attackers in the game. And now we're set up for a solid game. We can end up in a draw very easily, which for black in an advanced game, in an advanced game for black, if we end up in a draw, great. Then we flip places and we get white and then we go on the attack. But either way, we have now simplified this game into something where, and let's say even if we go aggressive with our knight, right? Notice black is super developed. This is defended, right? So we can even stick our bishop here, continue developing our other knight. Black is super advanced, developed, and white isn't. There's still a lot of work that white needs to do. I mean, look, black has already castled, man. So the King's Indian defense is a great setup, and we are not scared of the king's pawn because we've got the king's breaker, right? We get our queen's pawn up to break that. And that works for any point along this. If our opponent plays the king's pawn at any point in time, we put our king's pawn breaker. Whatever our opponent does, we just continue developing. And we are in good shape. We've got that little breaker point, and we're good. There's a little, spike roadblock. The nice thing is, let's say your opponent plays something that you don't know, right? They start into some kind of English opening. Okay, fine. I'm going to play my King's Indian setup. Then they're going to play something like that. Fine. Play my King's Indian setup. Oh no, they played the King's Pawn. What do? We get D6. We're ready to stop any shenanigans. Our opponent continues developing. We fee and Keto. They continue developing. We castle. We're set up for a game. We have, even if we're playing against advanced opponents, even if we're playing against players way above our level, this King's Indian defense, we can do it. We can do it, and we can hang with the big boys. And that's the whole purpose, all right? So we now have strategies. All right, this video is running a little long, but we now have strategies. If our opponent leans off with a king's pawn, which the vast majority of our opponents who are just learning chess are going to be playing, don't be scared of it at all, right? We know what to do. We mirror that pawn. Our opponent's probably going to attack. And even if they do something weird, you know what? We're going to basically do the same thing. And we're going to develop with tempo to defend. And our opponent is like, hey, I'm going to try to go into this 4 knights defense. I'm encouraging, I don't care. I'm going to continue to play my game, right? There's no threats here, really. So I'm just going to keep playing what I play and then force my opponent to basically start making decisions. So we know what to do if our opponent plays a king's pawn opening. If they go into an Italian game, we know that we're going to get our bishop out and we're going to mirror them. Or maybe we'll explore the Hungarian defense. Let's say we go into the Gioco piano, then we just play safe chess from here on out. Our priorities in the Gioco piano is to get this knight and get ready to castle. Those are our priorities in the Italian game. Let's say our opponent plays into the Ruy Lopez. We've got strategies. We can either go into the Morphy attack, or the Morphy defense, excuse me, or we can play the Berlin. We're secretly hoping our opponent's going to take, and we're going to capture away from center. We're secretly hoping we can get this trap in. It's not going to happen every time. It will happen a few times, but it's not going to happen every time. And we know that we can only do this as long as this pawn is undefended. As soon as our opponent defends that pawn, then we know that, aha, our trap isn't going to work, and our pawn needs to be defended. So, you know what? We're probably going to have to defend that pawn. If we go into the Morphy and our opponent retreats, that's fine. We're going to chase that pawn for just one move. We're not going to keep chasing it. Chase that bishop. Opponent's going to move, and then we're just going to go back to developing like normal. In fact, now that we've transitioned to this Italian game type structure, we can go back to, hey, we know the Italian game. The Italian game said we do that, or we do that, and we get our bishop out, because then there's no threat of this, and we're safe. And now we know the King's Indian. If our opponent plays something scary that we don't recognize, notice I can't push a king's pawn because it would immediately get captured. That's fine. Now we're gonna do our super advanced tactical King's Indian defense. And our opponent's gonna play something, and we're gonna get ready for our fianchetto. Our opponent's gonna play something. We know how to stop that with our king breaker, right? Our king's pawn breaker. And then our opponent's gonna develop. We're gonna fianchetto. They're gonna develop, and we're gonna castle. And look how safe we are. And then we're just gonna go play good chess. Okay. So these are some basic openings for the black side of the board. You can play pretty much against everyone you meet from here going forward. These openings are strong. They are documented. If you find that you like one of these openings, if you go, hey, I really like that fried liver thing, that was fun, there's Google chess fried liver attack, and you'll see the theory on it. You'll see ways to beat it. You'll see ways to get beat by it. If you really like the Berlin defense, Google it. Right there's tons of material. Go to the library. There's whole sections of physical books you can check out on chess. There's tons of opportunities for learning, but you don't have to. That's the beauty of it, is you don't have to memorize thousands upon thousands upon thousands of books on theory and blah, blah, blah. You just have to memorize basic opening principles. Control the center. Whoever controls the center controls the game. Don't push too many pawns. Develop your pieces, knights before bishops. Castle, get that king to safety. Get those rooks connected. Don't bring your queen out until it's time. And then you've got a few patterns here, right? From the white side of the board, you now know a standard setup, either the Italian Blah, 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 blah. You've got a standard setup you can use from white. Bring your knight out. Bring the knight out. Get the bishop, either the Italian or the Ruy Lopez. And either one, if your opponent plays either one, you know what to do from the other side of the board now. So if you sit down at a chessboard and you're faced with the white pieces or you're faced with the black pieces, you know what to do to set yourself up for playing standard, good, principled moves to give you whatever advantage you can get. And as long as you keep making those principled moves, your opponent's going to start making mistakes, and then you capitalize on those mistakes. Your opponent's going to make a move that's not so principled, leaves something accidentally undefended, and then you can pick it up. And then you'll start to build your own library of games that you've played. Because remember what rule number 1 in chess is? Rule number 1 is go play chess. But now you're going to develop some, a catalog of games that you've played, and you can start to get a feel for, gee, I really like this line, and so I'm going to keep playing this. Or, you know what? I don't like this line. I want to start looking for what's a more aggressive attack I can do against the Italian game. And you'll go, my opponents are all playing the Italian game, and I want to find ways to challenge them in ways that they may not be prepared for. Go for it. Go look up the Two Knights defense. Because not all Two Knights defense games are going to fall into the fried liver. There's tons of theory out there on how you might be able to do that. I have theory on the Alekhine. I've got some games on that. I've got games on the Russian or the Petrov down in there as well. There are tons of opportunities to mix things up. But the good news is, when you're first beginning, you don't have to worry about all that. All you have to do is play good, principled moves, and your opponents, who are also going to be beginners, are going to make mistakes. And hopefully, you make less mistakes, because we're going to make mistakes too. You go back and look at some of my games, guys. I make tons of mistakes. In fact, the game I played last night, while I was, just goofing off, I made some big mistakes. And I'm going to post that one up here in a little bit, and you can see all my mistakes. But we both are going to make mistakes. The goal is that we now have a plan on how to cut back on our mistakes. We now have a plan on how to play solid chess that has been, all the experts have studied, and people way smarter than us have played. And, like the King's Indian has been played by the all-time greats, Bobby Fischer, Mikhail Tal, Vladimir Kramnik. All of the all-time greats have played the King's Indian defense, and we can too, right? We can use their knowledge and use it to help develop our own repertoire on how we want to play games. Because every game is going to be different, and you're going to end up in positions you've never been in before. That's the fun part, man. That's the fun stuff. So go out, play chess, find ways to enjoy it, because I know you will, and hopefully this helps. Good luck, guys. I will see you next time. Bye.